In this video, we'll be talking about scholarly articles. Specifically, we'll be talking about the peer review process, which is the defining characteristic of a scholarly article. Then we'll talk about how to identify scholarly articles, and we'll wrap up by looking at a couple of examples to practice evaluating citations you'd find in article databases. Scholarly articles go through an extensive review process before they're published. This process, known as peer review, is what distinguishes scholarly articles from other types of publications, like news articles or magazines. So why is peer review so important? To answer this question, let's take a step back and take a closer look at what we mean when we say an article has been peer reviewed. Let's say one of your professors has written an article about her research and submitted it to a scholarly journal for publication. Before the journal publishes the article, the editor first sends it to several anonymous reviewers. These anonymous reviewers, or peer reviewers, are typically professors or researchers at other universities who are studying similar topics to your professor's research. In other words, the peers in peer review are experts in their field of study. These reviewers evaluate the article, make suggestions for improvements, and ultimately decide if the article should be published. Because several experts evaluate a scholarly article before it's published in a journal, peer review helps ensure that the research published in these journals is of high quality. Though peer review is the defining characteristic of scholarly articles, it's often not obvious if an article has been through the peer review process. But there are some common characteristics that you can use to help you identify scholarly articles in the article databases. The first characteristic I look at is how the article is written. Scholarly articles are written for a professional rather than a general audience, so they typically use specialized or technical language. Next, I look at the article's authors. Scholarly articles are written by experts, often professors, and their names and affiliations with universities or research institutes will be listed. In addition, scholarly articles are published in peer-reviewed journals as opposed to newspapers or magazines. The articles describe original research or analysis, which we'll talk more about in a minute, and scholarly articles always include references to their sources in footnotes or a bibliography. I want to take a minute now to say a little bit more about what it means that a scholarly article describes original research or analysis, because this can look very different from discipline to discipline. Most scholarly articles you'll find will be research studies, like if your professor conducted an experiment or a survey and then wrote an article describing their research methods and findings. But there are other sorts of scholarly articles too, where experts might offer a new perspective on a poem, comprehensively review the scholarly literature on a particular topic, or describe practical applications of their research findings. What all of these articles have in common is that they all contribute original knowledge and add to the scholarly conversation surrounding an area of research. As you're searching in the article databases, you'll probably notice that in many you can limit to scholarly journals or peer-reviewed articles. For example, in this database, you'll see we can limit to scholarly peer-reviewed journals, and there's also an academic journal icon showing up in my search results. While these limits can be super useful, it's important to know that they aren't 100% accurate. Scholarly journals publish some articles that don't fit into the categories of original research, and these are typically not peer-reviewed. These articles are often mislabeled scholarly in article databases. As an example, if we take a look at the table of contents from this scholarly journal, we see that it includes an editorial, news articles, and book reviews in addition to the peer-reviewed scholarly research articles and reports. So while this limit can be useful, make sure you're still evaluating the articles you find to see if they have the characteristics of scholarly articles and describe original research or analysis. Now that we've talked about peer review and common characteristics of scholarly articles, let's take a look at a couple of articles related to the impact of celebrity endorsements on people's political views to practice applying the characteristics of peer-reviewed articles to the citations you'll find in article databases. The first citation we'll look at is for an article titled Celebrity Politics: Effects of Endorser Credibility and Sex on Voter Attitudes, Perceptions, and Behaviors. Looking at the title of this article, I would say it's very specific, and that the language used seems to be aimed at a specialized audience. From the abstract, I learned that this article describes an experiment conducted by the authors, in other words, original research. I can see that the authors have .edu email addresses, and under author affiliations, I can see that they're professors at 2 different universities, in other words, experts. And looking at the source, I can see that this article was published in a peer-reviewed journal, the Social Science Journal. If you're not sure whether or not a publication has been peer-reviewed, try Googling the source title, and from that you can often learn whether or not it's a peer-reviewed journal. Finally, looking at the full article, I see that it includes a list of references at the end. This article has all of the characteristics of a scholarly article, and it's relevant to my research interests. This would be a great source to use for evidence that I could use to back up a point or support my argument. The second citation is for an article called Endorsement Risks. For every Oprah, there's a Farrakhan. Based on the title, this article isn't obviously about politics, and the language suggests a more general audience. From the abstract, I learned that this article talks about the effect of celebrity endorsements in the 2008 presidential elections, so it is relevant, but I don't see anything referring specifically to research in the abstract. The author doesn't have any affiliations listed, so probably a journalist rather than a professor, and looking at the source, I see that this article was published in U.S. News & World Report, which you may recognize as a respectable news publication, but it's not a peer-reviewed journal. Finally, if I look at the full article, the author doesn't list their references. This article doesn't have the characteristics of a scholarly article, but that doesn't mean it's a bad source. Relevant, popular news articles like this one can be useful for examining public opinion, learning about the issues surrounding a topic, researching very current events or local concerns, and so on. Different sources can be useful for different purposes, so you'll want to consider your audience, your purpose, and the kind of information that can fulfill your purpose when you're choosing your sources. To review what we talked about in this video, remember that scholarly articles are peer-reviewed before publication, which means that they've been reviewed by experts. To help you evaluate whether or not an article is scholarly, consider who the article was written for, the credentials of the author, where the article was published, whether the article describes original research or analysis, and finally, check to see if a references list or bibliography is included. Distinguishing between popular and scholarly sources is not always as cut and dry as the examples we just looked at. There's a lot of gray areas, so if you're not sure about a source, your instructor or any of the campus librarians are happy to help.